In autumn 1943, the Breslau Gestapo activated an independent section within the Gross-Rosen complex. It did not respond to SS command nor follow protocols of the main camp. It was a space reserved exclusively for experimental techniques. The prisoners arrived without clear backgrounds or subsequent destination. Inside, re-education procedures were applied that left permanent marks, tools to mark the face, substances that deformed the skin, and photographic records taken at each stage. The objective was not to punish or interrogate, it was to physically transform the inmates as a form of control. Why did the Gestapo need to systematically disfigure faces? How did the camps that disappeared people without leaving a trace function? And why did Gross-Rosen become the technical center of Nazi experimental cruelty? The Granite Hell, foundation of the Gross-Rosen camp. In August 1940, in the forests of Lower Silesia, the SS established what initially seemed to be a simple mining extension of the Sachsenhausen camp. Gross-Rosen was born as a subcamp destined to exploit the Granite Quarry owned by Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke GmbH, an SS company that fed the Reich's monumental architectural projects. The strategic location next to the Jaworstregum railway line facilitated both the arrival of prisoners and the export of extracted material. The first 7,000 inmates arrived between August and December 1940, finding themselves with improvised barracks, electrified wire fences, and the immense quarry that would dominate their existences. The initial exploitation followed conventional patterns of forced labor, stone extraction under armed surveillance, prolonged workdays, and physical punishments for minor infractions. May 1, 1941 marked a fundamental transformation. Gross-Rosen became administratively independent from Sachsenhausen under the command of SS Obersturmbannführer Arthur Rödel. This autonomy implied much more than a bureaucratic change. It represented the consolidation of a repressive system with capacity to develop its own methods without direct external supervision. Rödel implemented the first organizational innovations that would distinguish Gross-Rosen from other camps. He established 6 specialized operative divisions: general administration with detailed registration protocols, mining exploitation with individual quota systems, healthcare with selection functions rather than treatment, infrastructure focused on surveillance systems, security with specific training in control techniques, and subcamp management, which would be the most distinctive characteristic of the complex. The expansion under Wilhelm Gideon between September 1942 and October 1943 radically transformed the operational scale. Gideon developed the subcamp network that would reach more than 100 installations distributed throughout the region. This proliferation did not respond solely to economic needs, but to an experimental logic of territorial control. Each subcamp functioned as a laboratory for specific repressive techniques, reporting results to Central Command for analysis and replication. The subcamps specialized according to specific functions. Some focused on industrial exploitation with private companies, others on experimental corporal punishment techniques, some on controlled starvation methods, and several on low-profile extermination systems. This diversification allowed comparing the effectiveness of different repressive approaches applied to similar populations under controlled conditions. Johannes Hassbrook assumed command in October 1943 during the most ambitious phase of the complex. His planning included expanding capacity to 45,000 prisoners as a receiving center for evacuees from Auschwitz before the Soviet advance. Hassbrook introduced detailed documentation systems that recorded not only mortality and productivity, but also effectiveness of different punishment methods, psychological resistance of different ethnic groups, and optimization of social control techniques. The administrative structure developed under Hassbrook established precedents replicated later in other complexes. Personnel rotation systems were implemented that allowed transferring technical knowledge between installations, training protocols for new repressive methods, and evaluation systems that measured efficiency in terms of social control achieved per unit of invested resource. The Granite Quarry evolved from productive center to calibrated gradual extermination instrument. Specific techniques were developed to calculate average survival of prisoners according to age, ethnic origin, initial physical condition, and type of assigned work. This information allowed planning labor force replacements and adjusting work rhythms to maximize extraction before total physical collapse. Preserved records show that Gross-Rosen functioned according to industrial optimization principles applied to human life management. Decreasing productivity curves were calculated, comparative costs of maintenance versus worker replacement, and cost-benefit analysis of different exploitation intensities. This economic rationalization of extermination represented a specific innovation developed in the complex. The logistical network developed to connect the main camp with its satellites established models of central coordination with local autonomy that would be replicated in other concentrationary systems. Central Command established general objectives and provided technical resources, while local installations developed specific methods to achieve those objectives according to particular conditions. During 1944, the complex reached its maximum expansion with approximately 130,000 prisoners distributed in all its installations. This massive scale required developing communication, transportation, and coordination systems that functioned efficiently despite geographical distances and diversity of functions. Daily reporting protocols were established, rapid prisoner transfer systems between installations, and mechanisms for exchanging specialized technical personnel. Administrative documentation from the final period shows detailed planning for evacuation contingencies that included selective destruction of evidence, transfer of valuable personnel, and systematic elimination of potential witnesses. These protocols reveal that the SS considered preservation of technical knowledge developed in Gross-Rosen as priority over any humanitarian consideration. The evolution of Gross-Rosen between 1940 and 1945 illustrates the transformation of the Nazi concentrationary system from basic confinement towards systematic experimentation with total social control techniques. The complex not only exploited prisoners economically, it developed domination technologies that transcended immediate objectives to create transferable knowledge about management of subjected populations. Torture camps, the sadism of the Breslau Gestapo. The Arbeitserziehungslager, established in autumn 1943, represented a qualitative innovation in the Nazi repressive system. Operating under direct authority of the Breslau Gestapo, this installation functioned according to principles radically different from the main camp. While Gross-Rosen followed protocols established by the SS-WVHA, the AEL responded exclusively to the regional secret police, allowing it to develop experimental methods without external bureaucratic limitations. The selection of prisoners for the AEL followed specific criteria that included civilian workers accused of labor indiscipline, repeat offenders from the main camp, suspects of resistance, and, significantly, individuals chosen randomly for experimentation with repressive techniques. This experimental component was crucial. The Breslau Gestapo had received express authorization to develop innovative methods of forced re-education. The agents assigned to the AEL had been specifically trained in advanced interrogation techniques at the Berlin-Charlottenburg Police Academy. This training included modules on psychology applied to control, basic anatomy to maximize pain without causing immediate death, and administration of chemical substances for non-lethal punishment. The AEL personnel constituted a technical elite within the regional Gestapo. The architecture of the AEL had been specifically designed to facilitate experimentation with behavioral modification techniques. The barracks included basic laboratories for preparation of chemical compounds, observation rooms with recording systems to document prisoner reactions under different stimuli, and storage spaces for specialized tools developed locally. The development of disciplinary marking techniques constituted the most characteristic innovation of the AEL. Agents systematically experimented with methods to create permanent visible identifications that served multiple purposes: marking repeat offenders for future recognition, creating deterrent effects on other prisoners, and studying psychological resistance to progressive disfigurement. Facial marking tools were specifically developed in AEL workshops. Clubs were manufactured with serrated ends that created recognizable scar patterns, modified rifle butts with metallic protuberances that caused controlled fractures, and pressure devices that generated deformations without skin rupture. Each tool was calibrated to produce specific effects according to marking objectives. Marking protocols followed rigorous experimental methodology: subject's age, ethnic origin, initial physical condition, type of tool employed, Procedure duration and evolution of injuries during subsequent weeks were documented. This information was compiled in comparative studies that circulated among Gestapo installations as technical training material. Subcutaneous facial injections represented another line of research developed at the AEL. Attached medical personnel experimented with compounds that caused permanent deformation without risk of death, hypertonic saline solutions that provoked chronic swelling, irritating substances that generated excessive scarring, and compounds that altered skin pigmentation to create durable visible marks. Injection experiments followed rudimentary but systematic scientific protocols. Different concentrations of the same compound were applied to groups of prisoners. Variables such as reaction speed and effect durability were documented, and effectiveness of different facial application points was compared to maximize visible deformation. Results were compiled in technical reports that included before and after photographs. The most developed technique consisted of injections applied at specific anatomical points to cause permanent facial asymmetry. Doctors had identified that applications near cheekbones caused swelling that permanently deformed facial structure, while injections in the jawline created irregularities that made subsequent camouflage impossible through beard growth. The AEL also developed gradual modification techniques that applied progressive disfigurement over periods of weeks. Prisoners were subjected to regular marking sessions that gradually intensified deformation, allowing study of psychological resistance to progressive physical transformation. These studies included observation of behavioral changes, work capacity, and relationships with other prisoners. Photographic documentation constituted an integral part of the experimental system. Each prisoner was photographed before admission, after each marking session, and at the moment of transfer or death. These photographs were organized in individual files that included medical data, psychological evolution, and effectiveness of different applied techniques. Photographic archives circulated as educational material among Gestapo personnel. Psychological resistance studies developed at the AEL explored how facial disfigurement affected personal identity and social relationships. Cases of prisoners who developed selective mutism, refusal to eat due to shame about their appearance, and self-destructive behaviors after marking sessions were documented. This information was used to develop psychological control techniques applicable in other contexts. The AEL established exchange protocols with similar installations in other regions of the Reich. Technical personnel were temporarily transferred to transmit knowledge, reports on effectiveness of different methods were exchanged, and comparative experiments were coordinated applying similar techniques to different populations to verify result consistency. Methods developed at the AEL transcended their local application to influence repressive techniques employed throughout the Nazi system. Chemical compounds developed were distributed to other Gestapo installations, marking tools were reproduced in workshops of other camps, and application protocols were included in training manuals for repressive personnel. The informational closure of the AEL was absolute. Prisoners had no external contact, their names were eliminated from official records, and no documentation about their whereabouts was available to family members. This administrative invisibility allowed experimentation without risk of external supervision or subsequent legal responsibility, converting the AEL into a completely autonomous repressive techniques laboratory. Block 19, the core of controlled madness. Block 19 functioned according to an institutional logic different from both the main camp and the Arbeitserziehungslager. While the AEL experimented with corporal modification techniques, Block 19 specialized in systematic psychological annihilation through application of punishments that destroyed mental resistance capacity without causing immediate death. The architecture of Block 19 reflected its specific function. The building had been constructed with double-thick walls that prevented sound transmission, controllable artificial lighting system that allowed manipulation of sleep cycles, and adjustable ventilation that made it possible to create specific atmospheric conditions according to punishment objectives. Prisoners assigned to Block 19 entered a system of progressive identity annulment that had been specifically designed to study psychological disintegration processes. All reference to proper names was eliminated, replacing them with numerical codes that changed periodically to prevent prisoners from developing attachment to any form of stable identity. Daily routine was calculated to destroy normal cognitive patterns through imposition of schedules that changed unpredictably. Prisoners could be awakened at any hour, forced to perform activities without explanation of purpose, and subjected to contradictory orders that made it impossible to develop survival strategies based on prediction of guard behavior. Work assigned in Block 19 had evolved towards sophisticated forms of psychological torture that transcended physical exhaustion. Prisoners built structures that they immediately had to demolish, memorized lists of numbers that they then had to forget under threat of punishment, and performed complex mathematical calculations whose answers were systematically declared incorrect regardless of their precision. This imposition of absolute futility had been developed as a specific technique to destroy logical reasoning capacity. SS psychiatrists who supervised Block 19 had observed that prisoners subjected to prolonged contradictory work developed symptoms of mental dissociation that made them more susceptible to arbitrary orders and less capable of planning resistance. Physical punishments applied in Block 19 followed principles of psychological conditioning rather than simple application of pain. Random punishment techniques were employed that made it impossible to predict which behaviors would be sanctioned, creating states of constant anxiety that prevented any form of stable behavioral adaptation. The punishment system included occasional completely arbitrary rewards that served to maintain residual hope without providing real relief. Prisoners could unexpectedly receive an additional food portion or an extra hour of rest, but these benefits were withdrawn without explanation the next day, creating cycles of hope and despair that prevented total resignation. Block 19 capos had been specifically selected and trained in psychological manipulation techniques. They received instruction on how to alternate periods of apparent sympathy with extreme cruelty, create false alliances with prisoners that they then publicly betrayed, and apply punishments that seemed to arise from personal whims but followed planned institutional objectives. Documentation of prisoner behavior constituted a central aspect of the system. Changes in speech patterns, evolution of cognitive capacities, development of compulsive behaviors, and time required to produce different degrees of mental disintegration were recorded. This information was compiled in studies that circulated as training material for personnel of other camps. Block 19 developed specific techniques of psychological isolation that did not require physical separation. Prisoners were forced to wear masks that prevented mutual facial recognition. Any form of non-verbal communication was prohibited, and assignments were constantly rotated to prevent development of emotional bonds between inmates. Sensory deprivation experiments included techniques that alternated overstimulation with total absence of stimuli. Prisoners could be exposed for hours to intense noises and strobe lights, followed by periods of absolute silence and darkness. These alternations were calculated to disorient the nervous system and prevent adaptation to any specific condition. Block 19's medical documentation system included regular psychiatric evaluations that studied progression of mental symptoms under different types of pressure. Signs of depression, development of paranoid behaviors, loss of memory capacities, and appearance of psychotic symptoms were documented. This information was used to refine psychological pressure techniques and calculate mental resistance thresholds. Techniques developed in Block 19 were exported to similar installations in other camps through personnel exchange systems and protocol transfer. The most effective methods were documented in technical manuals that included detailed instructions on implementation, variables to control, and effectiveness indicators to measure results. Block 19 also functioned as a training center for personnel from other camps who required experience in psychological control techniques. The most effective guards were temporarily sent to other installations to transmit practical knowledge, establishing technical exchange networks that standardized repressive methods throughout the concentrationary system. Average survival duration in Block 19 had been statistically calculated to optimize deterrent impact on the rest of the camp. Prisoners remained long enough to develop visible symptoms of mental deterioration that served as warning to other inmates, but not so long as to die before fulfilling that exemplary function. Longitudinal studies conducted in Block 19 provided information on differential psychological resistance according to ethnic origin, previous education, age, and social condition. This information was used to develop personalized pressure techniques that exploited specific vulnerabilities of different population groups. Slave labor, dark science in service of the Reich. The collaboration between German private companies and the concentrationary system in Gross-Rosen established precedents that transformed both labor exploitation and applied medical research. This cooperation was not limited to simple utilization of slave labor. It included joint development of productive optimization techniques, experiments on limits of human resistance, and studies on comparative efficiency of different labor control methods. Siemens and Halske established in Gross-Rosen an applied research center that combined war production with experimentation on worker management under extreme coercion. Company engineers specifically designed productive processes that took advantage of the camp's unique conditions: availability of workers without rights, possibility of applying immediate physical punishment for errors, and capacity to experiment with schedules that would be illegal in normal labor contexts. Siemens workshops functioned as industrial efficiency laboratories under extreme conditions. Different combinations of negative incentives were experimented with to maximize productivity: ration reduction for errors, graduated physical punishments according to technical fault severity, and forced competition systems between worker groups that included collective punishments for individual low performance. Siemens' technical documentation included detailed studies on decreasing productivity curves in workers subjected to different levels of physical and psychological pressure. These studies revealed that optimal coercion thresholds existed that maximized performance without provoking immediate collapse, information that was subsequently applied in other Reich industrial installations. Engineers also developed efficiency measurement systems that considered not only immediate productivity, but worker replacement costs, training time for new operators, and economic comparison between maintenance of existing workers versus acquisition of new prisoners. This economic rationalization of human lives represented a specific innovation of business collaboration with the concentrationary system. Blaupunkt implemented a different model that emphasized technical specialization under extreme pressure. The company had observed that certain types of precision work could be effectively performed by prisoners under constant threat, provided minimal technical training was provided combined with immediate punishments for errors. This model balanced investment in training with coercive discipline. Processes developed by Blaupunkt included worker rotation systems that prevented prisoners from developing sufficient expertise to sabotage products, but allowed maintaining basic levels of technical quality. Optimal assignment periods to specific tasks were calculated that maximized useful learning while minimizing risks of organized resistance. Josef Mengeler's presence in Gross-Rosen during the first months of 1943 coincided with intensification of industrial collaboration and provided unique opportunities for medical studies applied to extreme labor conditions. Although Mengele did not develop in Gross-Rosen the experiments that would make him infamous later, his work included medical evaluations that contributed significantly to development of slave worker selection and management techniques. Mengele developed physical evaluation protocols that allowed predicting prisoner durability under different types of forced labor. His studies included lung capacity measurement, cardiovascular resistance, muscle mass, and basic psychological evaluation to determine labor assignments that would maximize productivity before total physical collapse. Medical criteria developed by Mengele included prisoner categorization according to survival expectancy under specific work conditions. This information was used by companies to plan production considering labor force replacement rates, allowing coordination between business objectives and inmate population management. Medical evaluations also included studies on effects of different types of physical punishment on subsequent labor capacity. Mengele documented how different forms of violence affected productivity, determining types of punishment that maximized deterrent effect without significantly reducing work capacity. This information was shared with industrial supervisors to optimize disciplinary systems. The Riese Project represented the culmination of collaboration between medical research, industrial engineering, and slave labor exploitation. This underground complex required coordination between multiple companies, continuous medical supervision to manage high mortality, and development of specific techniques for work under extreme conditions that exceeded any previous standard of labor exploitation. The TOT organization, responsible for the Riese Project, implemented management systems that explicitly treated workers as consumable resources with calculated wear rates. Actuarial studies were developed that calculated average useful life of prisoners under different underground work conditions, allowing logistical planning that included continuous supply of replacements. Medical studies conducted in the Riese Project included experiments on limits of human resistance in underground environments, effects of lack of sunlight on immune system, lung capacity under continuous exposure to mineral dust, and psychological resistance to prolonged confinement in closed spaces. This information contributed to development of labor exploitation techniques applicable in other industrial contexts. Technical documentation of the Riese Project included calculations on forced labor optimization that considered variables such as environmental temperature, humidity, exposure to toxic gases, and probability of fatal accidents. These studies established technical parameters for extreme labor exploitation that were subsequently applied in other Reich industrial projects. Participating companies also developed evacuation techniques that prioritized preservation of machinery and technical knowledge over worker lives. Protocols included selective destruction of evidence about collaboration with the concentrationary system, transfer of valuable technical personnel, and elimination of potential witnesses among slave workers. Business collaboration in Gross-Rosen established cooperation models between private sector and repressive apparatus that were replicated in other installations. Techniques developed for slave labor management, productivity optimization under coercion, and coordination between commercial objectives and extermination policies provided precedents for similar systems implemented subsequently in occupied territory. Studies on industrial efficiency under slave labor conditions produced technical information that transcended the specific context of the concentrationary system. Participating companies applied knowledge acquired about worker management under extreme pressure in other labor contexts during the post-war period, adapting techniques originally developed for prisoner exploitation to labor control systems in conventional industries. Gross-Rosen Crematorium, Invisible Factory of Death. The extermination system developed in Gross-Rosen represented a specific innovation within the Nazi apparatus. A low-profile murder model that operated through disguised medical techniques, discrete selective elimination, and evidence destruction methods that allowed systematically denying the existence of lethal operations. This hybrid system combined operational efficiency with plausible denial, establishing precedents for extermination techniques that could be applied in contexts where open mass murder was not politically viable. Construction of the crematorium during autumn 1942 marked the institutionalization of permanent elimination capabilities that transcended the camp's natural mortality management needs. The building had been specifically designed to operate discreetly. Chimney height calculated to disperse smoke without creating columns visible from distance, ventilation system that minimized odors detectable outside the perimeter, and location that prevented direct observation from prisoner work areas. The installed top-of D1 oven had been modified from standard specifications to optimize evidence elimination rather than energy efficiency. Modifications included enlarged combustion chamber that allowed incineration of personal objects along with cadavers, feeding system that enabled rapid introduction of multiple bodies, and temperature control mechanisms that guaranteed complete destruction of bone remains. Crematorium operation followed specific protocols developed to maximize evidence elimination while maintaining precise internal records for administrative management. Each incineration was documented with numerical code that did not include personal identification, but allowed statistical tracking for logistical planning. This system provided operational information without creating documentary evidence that could be used subsequently as proof of systematic murders. Lethal injection techniques developed in the Caesarraum represented the most sophisticated innovation of the Gross-Rosen system. SS medical personnel had systematically experimented with chemical compounds that caused rapid death without external signs of violence, allowing murders to be documented as natural deaths in official records. Lethal injection protocols included psychological preparation of victims through simulated medical procedures that reduced resistance and eliminated suspicions about lethal intentions. Prisoners were informed about routine medical examinations, preventive vaccinations, or treatments for minor illnesses. This psychological preparation allowed administering lethal injections without physical resistance that could alert other prisoners or create evidence of violence. Chemical compounds employed had been specifically selected for their availability in legitimate medical contexts, speed of action, and absence of post-mortem signs detectable in superficial examinations. Diluted cyanide solutions provided almost instantaneous death through cardiac arrest that could be attributed to natural causes, especially in prisoners previously weakened by camp conditions. The Cesieraum also functioned as a laboratory for development of medical murder techniques that could be applied in other contexts. Different concentrations of lethal compounds were experimented with to optimize speed versus detectability. Injection points that minimized physical evidence were tested, and preparation protocols that maximized victim cooperation were developed. Arboreal executions constituted the most visible element of the system, but had been specifically designed to serve disciplinary functions rather than mass elimination. The tree used had been selected for its location that allowed forced observation from multiple barracks, but prevented visibility from outside the camp, maintaining the internal character of operations. Hanging protocols included specific techniques developed to prolong agony for deterrent purposes. Ropes of calculated thickness were used to prevent immediate death by cervical rupture, body positions that prolonged asphyxiation for periods of up to 20 minutes, and pulley systems that allowed raising and lowering victims to maximize suffering, visible to forced witnesses. Photographic documentation of executions formed an integral part of the psychological control system. Administrative personnel systematically photographed each, hanging from angles that emphasized victim suffering and reactions of obligatory witnesses. These photographs circulated as training material among personnel of other camps, establishing technical standards for application of exemplary punishments. Selective shootings were reserved for cases that required immediate elimination without deterrent ceremony. These executions followed protocols developed to minimize noise and ballistic evidence. Weapons with improvised silencers were employed, low-caliber ammunition that reduced excessive penetration, and firing angles calculated to direct projectiles toward absorption areas that prevented audible ricochets. Cadaver elimination had evolved toward an industrial system that converted human remains into usable resources. Bodies were systematically processed to extract valuable elements before cremation, dental extraction of precious metals, hair collection for industrial use, confiscation of reusable clothing, and recovery of hidden objects that might have commercial value. Processing also included forensic evidence elimination techniques developed specifically to prevent subsequent victim identification. Identifying marks such as distinctive scars, tattoos, and physical particularities that could allow recognition by family members were systematically removed. This physical identity elimination complemented destruction of documentary records. Ashes resulting from cremation were managed according to protocols that eliminated evidence while generating secondary economic benefits. Human ashes mixed with lime and earth were used as fertilizer in SS crops, providing agricultural improvements while completely eliminating identifiable remains. This practice transformed victims into resources that economically benefited their murderers. Cremation registration systems maintained statistical precision without creating compromising documentary evidence. Each incineration was documented with numerical codes that allowed internal administrative tracking, but did not include names, causes of death, or information that could be used to identify specific victims or demonstrate systematic murders. Management of multiple simultaneous extermination methods required development of coordination systems that optimized efficiency while maintaining operational compartmentalization. Different teams specialized in specific methods without knowledge of parallel operations, creating plausible denial systems that protected personnel from subsequent legal responsibility. Evidence evacuation protocols developed for the extermination system included selective destruction techniques that preserved useful operational information while eliminating proof of specific murders. Technical records on method efficiency that could be applied in other contexts were maintained, but documents that identified individual victims or specific murder methods were completely destroyed. The system developed in Gross-Rosen established technical precedents for extermination operations that could operate under external scrutiny without detecting definitive evidence of systematic murders. Techniques of plausible denial, evidence elimination, and operational compartmentalization were subsequently applied in other contexts where extermination had to occur without official recognition. Ghost subcamps, architects of total oblivion. The expansion of the Gross-Rosen complex toward the end of 1943 did not only respond to logistical needs of production or main camp decongestion. A significant part of the satellite system developed under Johannes Hassbrook's command consisted of special-purpose installations that were never designed for permanence. These subcamps, whose existence was inferred from partial records, fragmentary testimonies, and incomplete logistical documents, constitute a separate category within the Nazi repressive system, temporary installations destined to operate outside the documentary circuit, without fixed structure, without nominal identification, and without purpose of administrative preservation. Records recovered after the war reveal the existence of at least 14 subcamps that do not appear on any official SSWVHA map, but whose names appear briefly in railway correspondence, supply orders, or transfer authorizations. Designated with generic names like Forststelle Süd, Baupunkt 32, or simply Außenlager X, these places were active for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 3 months, housing prisoner populations that were not included in periodic censuses of the concentrationary system. The physical structure of these ghost subcamps was deliberately rudimentary. Instead of barracks built with treated wood or tin roofs, as in larger installations, reused army tents were employed, thickened fabric structures mounted on piles, or simply trenches roofed with zinc sheets. The ground was covered with compacted gravel to avoid mud accumulation, and sanitary installations consisted of temporary pits delimited by ropes. This configuration allowed dismantling the complete subcamp in less than 24 hours without leaving significant structural trace. Personnel assigned to these places belonged almost exclusively to SS units with mobile functions, punishment commandos, demolition teams, transport technicians, or medical units with terminal treatment functions. No permanent administrators or regular Totenkopfverband guards were assigned, and prisoner movement records were replaced by numerical codes that only appeared in internal railway logistics lists. The absence of formal administration allowed operating these places with absolute autonomy without external scrutiny and without creating documentation susceptible to future verification. The specific function of these subcamps varied according to moment and location, but all shared a common logic: experimentation with complete operational disappearance. Some installations were used for selective executions through deprivation, others for testing chemical substances on unregistered civilian populations, and several functioned as transit stations where all trace of transferred prisoners was lost. In all cases, the operational principle was the same: to create a space of controlled erasure where repression was not only executed, but structurally hidden from its design. One of the few partially documented examples corresponds to Außenlager Brig 2, mentioned in an internal letter from SS Untersturmführer Hans Wilfer to the Hauptamt Ordnungspolizei. In the missive, authorization is requested to transport Class 2 human cargo toward a temporary installation without fixed name, with instructions not to register arrival or departure until new order. The expression Class 2 human cargo appears in other documents as euphemism for prisoners designated for elimination without registration, many of them children, elderly or pregnant women without assigned prisoner number. No subsequent records of Brig 2 exist. The place was never located by Soviet or Polish teams after the war. Another emblematic case is that of Baupunkt R12, mentioned in a supply order from Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke. This installation operated for a month near the Riese Project tunnels and received shipments of cement, wiring, and manual demolition tools, in addition to a transfer of 300 prisoners without origin registration. A railway report mentions that none of the prisoners returned to main camps. It is presumed that R12 functioned as an execution point under conditions of induced collapse. Galleries were sealed with dynamite after prisoner entry, destroying both human lives and any possibility of remains recovery. The use of mobile subcamps to test physical disappearance techniques without traces responded to a strategic evolution within the repressive apparatus. From 1944, with the Soviet advance over eastern Poland and increasing possibility of future German surrender, the SS developed methods to minimize forensic traces of mass crimes. Gross-Rosen, due to its decentralized structure and its network of autonomous subcamps, offered the ideal scenario for these tests. The nameless camps thus became laboratories of oblivion, spaces where murder ceased to be event and became process without archive. Personnel operating these places was selected for their experience in elimination operations without witnesses. Many came from dissolved T4 units after the closure of euthanasia centers, or from Einsatzgruppen commandos with experience in mobile mass graves. Their technical knowledge included from open incineration techniques with smoke reduction to silent execution methods through cervical pressure or oral administration of cyanide in food. These techniques were applied under controlled conditions, and their results evaluated solely based on absence of subsequent evidence. Fragmentary archives of the Breslau Gestapo, partially recovered by Soviet authorities in 1945, include marginal references to mobile installations for finalization of disciplinary processes without administrative continuity. This bureaucratic formula alluded to subcamps where prisoners considered irreversible were sent, that is, not suitable for reintegration or exemplary public execution. Decisions about their dispatch were made in closed sessions of subcamp commanders, without court intervention or medical documentation. The objective was to disappear individuals and their archives simultaneously, ensuring they could never be located, identified, or remembered. Environmental conditions became extermination tools. Some subcamps were established in swampy areas, abandoned mines, or forest areas with dense fog and difficult access. These locations not only hindered aerial or terrestrial detection, but accelerated body decomposition, prevented subsequent excavations, and allowed justifying disappearance as natural accident or escape. The logic of environment as operational accomplice was systematized. Sites were chosen where disappearance could be attributed to external causes without need for visible direct human action. Several trains with prisoners destined for these subcamps disappeared without leaving trace of destination. In Polish archives of Jawor are found records of convoys that departed toward destinations designated only with incomplete coordinates, without annotated arrival point. Railway witnesses interrogated after the war affirmed that some trains were unloaded directly in forest zones, where prisoners were escorted by patrols that did not return with them. No returns or reassignments were recorded. Only empty wagons and a change in logistical numbering remained. The experimental dimension of these subcamps also included administrative practices of documentary disappearance, methods of selective record elimination, falsification of transit codes, and use of interchangeable forms that allowed reassigning numerical identity without leaving record of specific individuals were tested. These techniques were developed by SS Hauptamt officers who collaborated with Gross-Rosen's archive apparatus, and later applied in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen during final evacuations. The principle was clear: not only must the body disappear, but also its category, its number, and its trajectory. The few available testimonies come from prisoners who managed to escape during hasty dismantling of some of these installations. Their accounts, collected by Soviet teams in 1945, describe nameless spaces, commanders without visible insignia, and workdays without apparent purpose. One of them spoke of a camp where each night prisoners were asked to dig a new trench, only to be transferred at dawn. Another affirmed that orders were transmitted without words, through whistles and hand signals, and that punishments were executed without explanation or registration. These accounts coincide in a common sensation: the perception of having been in a place that should not exist, and from which no one was expected to leave alive or with memory. The logic of ghost subcamps was not that of punishment or forced labor, but that of total denial of existence. Unlike main camps, where at least a bureaucratic logic of registration existed, nameless camps operated under the principle that the perfect crime is not one that leaves no witnesses, but one that leaves no evidence that anything has occurred at all. Contemporary research on these subcamps continues to be fragmentary. Without coordinates, without official names, without preserved structures, and without complete archives, their reconstruction depends on crossed inferences, inverse geolocation, and isolated testimonies. But their probable existence, even more their operational function within the Gross-Rosen system, reveals an unprecedented dimension of the Nazi repressive apparatus, the industrialization not only of suffering or death, but of disappearance as power technology. Memory Among Ashes, the legacy of Gross-Rosen. The liberation of Gross-Rosen on February 14, 1945, revealed a landscape of absence rather than presence. Empty structures that testified about elimination systems so efficient they had managed to almost completely erase evidence of their own existence. The 150 survivors found by the Red Army constituted a minimal fraction of the more than 40,000 prisoners who had populated the complex during its last operational months. Evacuation marches initiated on February 8 had functioned as the final phase of the extermination system, specifically designed to eliminate potential witnesses without creating documentary evidence of mass murders. The 44,000 prisoners forced to abandon the camp under extreme winter conditions were systematically eliminated during journeys that officially constituted evacuations toward other camps, but operationally functioned as mobile extermination operations. Initial Soviet reports documented the discovery of evidence elimination systems more sophisticated than those found in other previously liberated camps. Gross-Rosen had developed selective destruction techniques that preserved useful infrastructure while eliminating specific proof of extermination operations, demonstrating advanced planning for liberation scenarios. Documentation recovered by the Soviets included fragments of records that revealed the existence of specific protocols for evidence destruction. Detailed instructions were found about what types of documents should be destroyed with priority, what physical evidence should be eliminated, and what elements could be preserved without compromising denial of extermination operations. The period of Soviet administration between 1945 and 1947 was characterized by tensions between immediate practical utilization of installations and considerations about historical preservation. Urgent needs for housing refugees and German prisoners of war initially prevailed over conservation objectives, resulting in significant modifications of original structures. The Soviet decision to maintain the crematorium operative during this period to manage mortality in prisoner of war camps generated subsequent controversies about contamination of historical evidence. However, this continued utilization also provided technical information about operational capacities of the equipment that would not have been available otherwise. The transfer to Polish administration in March 1947 coincided with the beginning of international discussions about preservation of sites related to Nazi crimes. The Polish government faced contradictory pressures between eliminating traumatic reminders of the occupation period and preserving historical evidence for education and future legal responsibility. The 1948 trials against Hassbrook, Eschner, and Drozdauskas established crucial legal precedents about responsibility for development of experimental repressive techniques. The Soviet tribunal focused specifically on technical innovations developed in Gross-Rosen, including facial mutilation methods, medical extermination techniques, and evidence elimination systems that constituted specific contributions to the Nazi repressive apparatus. Evidence presented during the trials included detailed testimonies about facial disfigurement experiments that provided unique documentation about these practices. Survivors described specific techniques that had not been documented in other camps, establishing Gross-Rosen as a development center for repressive methods that were subsequently applied in other installations. The musealization process initiated in 1953 faced unique challenges related to representation of mutilation and torture techniques that exceeded cruelty standards documented in other commemorative sites. Planners developed innovative approaches that documented these practices without resorting to graphic representations that could constitute exploitation of victim suffering. Reconstruction of the crematorium as central element of the memorial required detailed technical research about original equipment specifications. Topf and Sona archives provided information about specific modifications made for the Gross-Rosen installation, revealing technical adaptations that differentiated this crematorium from similar installations in other camps. Reconstructed barracks incorporated design elements that allowed representing living conditions without completely reproducing the claustrophobia and degradation of original spaces. Exhibition techniques were developed that communicated historical reality while maintaining educational functionality and considerations about psychological well-being of visitors. Preservation of the gong bell as sonic element of the memorial created unique opportunities for educational experiences that included auditory dimensions of historical experience. Reconstruction of its tower after the 2002 collapse included protection systems that guarantee long-term preservation of this original element. Development of photographic archives specialized in documentation of facial mutilations required establishment of specific ethical protocols about access and utilization of images that represent extreme suffering. Restricted consultation systems were created that allow academic research while protecting dignity of represented victims. Archaeological excavations initiated in the 1990s revealed physical evidence of evidence elimination techniques that had not been documented in written records. Discovery of graves with human remains chemically treated to accelerate decomposition provided material proof of methods specifically developed in Gross-Rosen. Contemporary research on business collaboration has revealed dimensions of camp history that were not fully understood during decades following liberation. Corporate archives of Siemens and Blaupunkt, accessible only after legal changes in the 1990s, documented levels of cooperation with labor exploitation experiments that exceeded previous estimates. The site currently functions as a research center on repressive techniques that provides relevant information for understanding contemporary authoritarian social control systems. Methods of psychological manipulation, disfigurement as control instrument, and evidence elimination developed in Gross-Rosen offer perspectives on repression mechanisms that transcend specific historical contexts. Contemporary museum representation incorporates digital technologies that allow presentation of sensitive historical documentation without direct exposure of traumatic graphic material. Gradual access systems have been developed that provide detailed information to researchers while offering educational experiences appropriate for general audiences. The Gross-Rosen Memorial constitutes a unique laboratory for exploration of ethical limits in representation of extreme atrocities. Techniques developed to document facial mutilations and torture experiments have established standards for other commemorative sites that face similar challenges of historical preservation versus protection of victim dignity. The site's evolution since 1953 reflects broader changes in Holocaust historical memory approaches, but also contributes specific perspectives on preservation of evidence of technical innovations in systematic cruelty application. Gross-Rosen remains as testimony about human capacities for development of suffering systems that transcend conventional categories of moral understanding.